of hard-working Americans watching from home? When entitlement collides with earned respect, and only one can walk away with dignity intact? What you're about to witness is the moment Meghan Markle discovered that being royal doesn't grant permission to treat people poorly on national television. This is the interview that started as a routine charitable promotion and devolved into one of the most uncomfortable confrontations in morning show history. This is Michael Strahan, the beloved host, known for his warmth, professionalism, and patience, reaching his breaking point after 30 minutes of relentless attacks on his intelligence, his career, his audience, and everything his show represents. This isn't just another celebrity meltdown. This is what happens when someone mistakes a platform for a pulpit, when condescension meets consequences, when a host decides that defending his viewers matters more than maintaining comfortable fiction. And it's the moment America watched a former NFL star turned broadcasting icon remind everyone that respect is earned through action, not demanded through title. Meghan Markle came to Good Morning America expecting to lecture the masses. What she got instead was a masterclass in how treating people with contempt eventually forces even the kindest professional to say, "Enough." Buckle up, because what unfolds is not just great television. It's a cultural moment about entitlement, respect, and what happens when someone finally refuses to accept being talked down to for the sake of politeness. The Good Morning America studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy that morning, the familiar choreography of live television unfolding with practiced precision. Lighting technicians made final adjustments to create the perfect warm glow that makes guests look their best. Camera operators positioned their equipment for optimal angles, checking and rechecking that everything was perfectly framed. Audio engineers ran through final sound checks, ensuring every word would be captured clearly for the millions of viewers who'd be tuning in from homes across America. Michael Strahan sat in his anchor chair, reviewing his notes with the comfortable confidence that comes from years of hosting experience. He transitioned from NFL stardom to broadcasting success through genuine warmth and professionalism, building a reputation as someone who could make any guest feel comfortable while still asking substantive questions. His producers had pitched this interview as straightforward, a royal guest discussing charitable work, exactly the kind of feel-good segment that brightened morning routines and sent people off to work feeling inspired. The booking had seemed perfect on paper. A high-profile guest with a recognizable name, projects to promote, causes to highlight. The kind of interview that generates social media buzz and gives viewers something positive to discuss around their office coffee machines. Nobody anticipated what was actually about to unfold, the slow-motion disaster that would dominate headlines for weeks and become required viewing in journalism schools as an example of how quickly interviews can spiral into chaos. The production assistant's voice came through Michael's earpiece. "Guest is arriving now. 2 minutes to airtime." Michael flashed his signature smile, that genuine warmth that had made him a morning television favorite. He'd interviewed presidents and world leaders, athletes and actors, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. He knew how to put guests at ease, how to draw out compelling stories, how to make television that informed and entertained without being exploitative or cruel. Today should be no different, or so he thought. As the familiar Good Morning America theme music faded and cameras went live, Michael addressed the audience with his characteristic enthusiasm. "Good morning, America. I'm Michael Strahan, and we have a very special guest with us today. Please welcome Meghan Markle." The applause was polite but enthusiastic as Meghan walked onto the set. She settled into the plush interview chair across from Michael, smoothing her designer dress with practiced precision, offering what appeared to be a carefully calibrated smile. The studio lights caught the expensive jewelry adorning her wrists and neck. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. Just another celebrity interview about to unfold according to the familiar script. But something in her posture, something in the way she surveyed the studio with an expression that seemed more evaluating than appreciative, should have served as warning to those paying close attention. This wasn't going to be a typical interview. Not even close. "Meghan, thank you so much for joining us this morning," Michael began, his voice carrying that warm professional tone that had made him beloved by viewers. "I know our audience is excited to hear about your latest charitable work. You've been involved with several organizations recently." Meghan's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, and something flickered across her expression. Something that might have been annoyance, or perhaps contempt, poorly disguised as patience. "Well, Michael, I appreciate you having me on," she said, her tone already carrying an edge that made several crew members exchange glances. "Though I have to say I'm surprised by how basic that question is. I would have expected something more substantive from someone in your position." The comment hung in the air like a bad smell. It wasn't quite an insult, not overtly, but the condescension was unmistakable to anyone listening. Michael's extensive media training kicked in immediately, his smile never wavering despite the unexpected rudeness. "Of course," he replied smoothly, giving her the benefit of the doubt. "Let's dive deeper then. Can you tell us about the specific impact you're hoping to make with your foundation work?" "Impact?" Meghan's tone had shifted noticeably, becoming more openly condescending now, as if Michael had just asked the stupidest question imaginable. "Michael, I think you're missing the bigger picture here. The work I do isn't just about impact. It's about transformation. It's about changing the entire landscape of how we think about social responsibility. But I suppose that might be difficult for some people to grasp." The camera operators exchanged glances behind their equipment. This wasn't the friendly celebrity interview they had prepared for. The energy in the studio had changed completely, shifting from warm anticipation to uncomfortable tension. But Michael remained the consummate professional, leaning forward slightly with what appeared to be genuine interest. "That's fascinating, Meghan," he said, maintaining his composure despite the obvious slight. "Can you give our viewers some concrete examples of this transformation you're working toward?" Meghan's laugh was sharp and dismissive, the kind of sound that immediately puts people on edge. "Concrete examples," she repeated, as if the words themselves were somehow beneath her. "Michael, you're thinking too small. You're trapped in this old-fashioned media mindset where everything has to be reduced to sound bites and simple explanations. The work I'm doing operates on a much higher level than that." "I understand," Michael replied smoothly, though viewers at home could sense his patience being tested, could hear the slight strain creeping into his voice. "But our audience includes people from all walks of life who might be inspired to get involved in similar work. Could you help them understand how they might contribute?" "That's exactly the problem," Meghan said, her voice rising slightly with obvious frustration. "Everyone wants to contribute, but they don't want to do the real work of understanding the complexities involved. They want everything handed to them in neat little packages. That's not how real change happens, Michael." The producer in the control room was frantically signaling to the floor manager, sensing that the interview was spiraling away from its intended direction into territory that was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Michael, reading the room perfectly with decades of experience guiding his instincts, attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Let's talk about your recent trip to New York, where you visited several community centers," he suggested, offering her an easy out, a simple question she could answer without controversy. "What was that experience like for you?" Meghan's eyes narrowed visibly, and her response came with barely concealed contempt. "You know, Michael, I find it interesting that you're focusing on the trip rather than the systemic issues those community centers are trying to address. It's this kind of surface-level journalism that prevents real progress from being made." "I'm certainly interested in discussing those systemic issues," Michael responded, his professionalism intact, despite the increasingly hostile tone from his guest, despite the clear attacks on his competence. "What would you say are the most pressing concerns you encountered?" "The most pressing concern," Meghan said, her voice now dripping with condescension that was impossible to miss or misinterpret, "is that people in positions like yours, with platforms like this, continue to ask the wrong questions. You have millions of viewers, Michael, and you're wasting that opportunity on superficial celebrity chit-chat." The studio audience, which had been politely attentive, was beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some viewers at home were already reaching for their remote controls, unsure whether they were witnessing a train wreck or some kind of bizarre performance art. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady, a testament to years of broadcast experience navigating difficult interviews. I appreciate your perspective, Meghan. Our goal here is always to inform and inspire our viewers. If there are specific issues you'd like to highlight, I'm more than happy to give you that platform. Platform, Meghan repeated, her tone becoming increasingly sharp and hostile. Michael, this isn't about you giving me anything. This is about you doing your job properly. When was the last time you challenged your guests to think beyond their comfort zones? When was the last time you used this show to address real issues instead of promoting celebrity projects? The control room was in chaos. The producer was debating whether to cut to commercial early, while the director was frantically trying to decide which camera angles would best capture what was rapidly becoming a complete disaster. But Michael was handling the situation with the grace and professionalism that had defined his career, even as his guests systematically attacked everything he'd worked to build. We cover a wide range of topics on Good Morning America, he said calmly, his voice carrying quiet authority. Today we invited you here to discuss your charitable work, because our viewers are interested in learning about causes they might want to support. If you'd prefer to discuss other topics, we can certainly do that. Other topics? Meghan's voice had reached a pitch that was making the audio engineers wince behind their equipment. Michael, everything is connected. You can't separate charitable work from politics, from social justice, from the fundamental inequalities that plague our society. But I suppose that level of thinking might be too complex for morning television. The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the atmosphere of the entire studio. Several crew members looked toward Michael with genuine concern, wondering how he would respond to such a blatant attack on his intelligence and professional capabilities. The man had been nothing but courteous, had given her every opportunity to share her message, and she was repaying that courtesy with condescension and contempt. Michael took a deep breath, his hands clasped calmly in his lap, displaying a level of control that most people couldn't maintain under such provocation. Meghan, I think our viewers would benefit from hearing about specific ways they can get involved in causes you care about. Can we focus on actionable steps people can take? Actionable steps? Meghan's laugh was bitter and dismissive, the sound grating on everyone's nerves. Michael, you're still not getting it. The first actionable step is for people like you to stop dumbing down important conversations. The second step is to stop treating your audience like they're incapable of handling complex ideas. The personal attacks were becoming more frequent and more pointed with each exchange. Michael's legendary professionalism was being tested in ways that few television hosts ever experience, but he continued to maintain his composure, understanding that millions of viewers were watching to see how he would handle this increasingly hostile situation. But there's only so much disrespect a person can tolerate, even on live television. And Michael Strahan was rapidly approaching his limit. What happened next would go down as one of the most uncomfortable, yet ultimately satisfying moments in morning television history. Michael, still maintaining his professional demeanor despite the relentless personal attacks, decided to give his guest one more opportunity to redirect the conversation constructively. Meghan, I can see you're passionate about these issues, he said, his voice steady but with just a hint of strain that keen observers could detect. Perhaps you could share with our viewers what originally inspired you to get involved in charitable work. Meghan's response was immediate and cutting, delivered with barely concealed contempt. What inspired me, Michael, was seeing how people in positions of influence consistently failed to use their platforms responsibly, present company included. The studio fell silent except for the hum of equipment. Even the cameramen, seasoned professionals who had seen countless interviews go sideways, were stunned by the brazen disrespect being displayed on live television. This wasn't just rude anymore. This was personal, calculated, and completely unacceptable. Michael's smile finally began to fade, replaced by a more serious expression that regular viewers would recognize as significant. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that, Meghan." "Of course you don't understand," she replied with a dismissive wave of her hand that somehow managed to convey maximum disrespect. "That's exactly the problem. You're sitting there asking me fluffy questions about community center visits, when there are children going hungry, when there are families being torn apart by systemic racism, when there are women being silenced by patriarchal structures. And your response is to ask me about inspiration? Those are certainly important issues," Michael replied, his patience wearing visibly thin now, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. "If you'd like to discuss any of those topics specifically, we can absolutely do that. But attacking me personally isn't going to help address any of those problems." Meghan's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like anger, though it was hard to distinguish from the contempt that had characterized her entire demeanor. "Attacking you? Michael, I'm trying to educate you. There's a difference, though I realize that distinction might be lost on someone who spent their career asking celebrities about their workout routines and favorite recipes." The personal insult about his career hit its mark. Michael had worked incredibly hard to establish himself as a serious journalist and television host, transitioning from his sports career with dedication and professionalism that had earned him respect throughout the industry. The crew could see his jaw clench slightly, could sense the shift in his energy, though his voice remained controlled. "I've been fortunate to interview world leaders, Nobel Prize winners, and people making real differences in their communities," he said quietly, each word precisely measured. "I take my responsibility to our viewers very seriously. Do you?" Meghan's tone was openly mocking now, all pretense of civility completely abandoned. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you take your paycheck seriously. There's a difference between responsibility and just showing up to collect a salary." That was the line, the moment that changed everything. The insult that finally pushed Michael Strahan past his legendary patience into territory where he would defend himself, his show, and his audience with the full force of his professional authority. The control room was in complete chaos. The producer was frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial while network executives who had been alerted to the disaster unfolding on live television were making urgent phone calls. But Michael wasn't backing down anymore. Something fundamental had shifted in his demeanor, and everyone watching could sense it. "Meghan," he said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "I invited you here as a guest on our show, and I've tried to give you every opportunity to share your message with our audience. But I won't sit here and let you insult me, our show, or our viewers." "Your viewers?" Meghan's laugh was sharp and contemptuous, revealing the full extent of her disdain. "Michael, your viewers are part of the problem. They're content to sit in their living room sipping their coffee, feeling good about themselves for watching a segment about charity work. But they're not actually doing anything meaningful to create change." The camera caught several audience members looking genuinely offended. These were real people who had taken time out of their morning to attend a taping, and now they were being insulted by someone they had come to see. Michael's protective instincts kicked in immediately, not for himself, but for the millions of hardworking Americans being attacked. "I think you're underestimating our audience, Meghan," he said, and there was steel in his voice now. "The people watching this show are teachers, nurses, parents, small business owners, people who work hard every day to support their families and contribute to their communities." "Contribute?" Meghan's voice rose again, her contempt reaching new heights. "Michael, showing up to work and paying taxes isn't contribution. It's basic functioning. Real contribution requires sacrifice, requires challenging the status quo, requires making people uncomfortable. But I suppose that's too much to ask from people who get their news from morning television." The insults were now directed not just at Michael, but at the millions of Americans watching at home. Social media was already exploding with outrage, as viewers expressed their shock at what they were witnessing. But Michael had heard enough. The moment had come to defend not just himself, but every hard-working person being insulted by his guests' arrogant behavior. He leaned forward slightly, his professional mask finally slipping to reveal genuine anger beneath. "Meghan, I think you need to be very careful about how you characterize the people who are watching this program." "Careful?" she shot back immediately. "Michael, careful is exactly the problem. Everyone's so worried about being careful, about not offending anyone, about maintaining the comfortable status quo. Meanwhile, real issues go unaddressed because people like you are too careful to ask the hard questions." "What hard questions would you like me to ask?" Michael's voice had an edge to it now that every viewer could hear the sound of a man who'd been pushed too far and was about to push back. "How about this?" Meghan said, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied smirk that revealed she thought she was winning this exchange. "When was the last time you used your platform to challenge your viewers' preconceptions? When was the last time you made them genuinely uncomfortable with truths they didn't want to hear? When was the last time you did anything other than serve up easily digestible entertainment disguised as journalism?" The attack on his professional integrity was the final straw. Michael had endured personal insults, watched his guest attack their viewers, and maintained his composure throughout. But questioning his journalistic credentials struck at the core of who he was as a professional, at everything he'd worked to build over years of dedication to his craft. "I've covered natural disasters, interviewed families dealing with tragedy, highlighted social injustices, and given a platform to people fighting for important causes," he said, his voice steady but firm with barely contained emotion. "I don't need to attack my guests or insult my audience to prove my commitment to journalism. Don't you?" Meghan's tone was now openly hostile, all pretense of civility completely destroyed. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you need to do something to prove you're more than just a pretty face reading from a teleprompter." The studio was dead silent. Even the most experienced crew members had never witnessed such blatant disrespect on a live television program. Michael's hands were clenched in his lap, and for a moment it seemed like he might actually lose his composure entirely. Instead, he took a deep breath and spoke with quiet dignity that carried more power than shouting ever could. "Meghan, I think it's clear that this interview isn't going in a productive direction. Perhaps we should move on to our next segment." "Oh, now you want to move on?" Meghan's voice was dripping with sarcasm. "How convenient. When the conversation gets real, when someone challenges you to step up to your responsibilities, suddenly it's time to move on to something more comfortable." "This isn't about comfort," Michael replied, his voice gaining strength with each word. "This is about respect. Respect for our viewers, respect for this platform, and basic human respect. You've been given every opportunity to share your message, but instead, you've chosen to attack me personally and insult the people who watch this program." Meghan's response would become the moment that sealed her fate on the show, the line that would be replayed endlessly on social media and analyzed in journalism schools. "Respect?" she said with a bitter laugh. "Michael, respect is earned, not given. And frankly, I haven't seen anything this morning that suggests you've earned it." The gasps from the studio audience were audible even over the equipment hum. Several crew members shook their heads in disbelief. The producer in the control room was already making the call that would end this disaster. But Michael wasn't finished defending himself and his show. Not by a long shot. "You know what, Meghan?" he said, his voice calm, but carrying unmistakable authority that filled the entire studio. "I've been in this business for a long time. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, Nobel laureates, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. In all that time, I've never encountered a guest who seemed more interested in tearing others down than building anything up." Meghan's eyes widened slightly, perhaps realizing for the first time that she had pushed too far, that this wasn't going to end the way she'd imagined. "Excuse me? You heard me," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, as years of professional courtesy gave way to justified anger. You came on this show supposedly to talk about charitable work, about helping people, about making a positive difference in the world. Instead, you've spent the entire interview attacking me, attacking our viewers, and demonstrating exactly the kind of entitled, condescending attitude that turns people away from the causes you claim to care about. The studio was electric with tension. Crew members who had been looking uncomfortable were now watching with rapt attention, as one of television's most respected hosts finally fought back against the most disrespectful guest in the show's history. This was no longer an interview, this was a reckoning. Meghan's face flushed red with anger, and perhaps embarrassment as the reality of the situation began to dawn on her. How dare you speak to me like that? Do you have any idea who I am? I know exactly who you are, Michael replied without hesitation, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You're someone who thinks your title gives you the right to treat people poorly. You're someone who believes that being rude and condescending somehow makes you appear intelligent or important. And you're someone who has completely forgotten that respect is a two-way street. I don't have to listen to this, Meghan said, starting to remove her microphone with hands that trembled slightly, whether from anger or embarrassment. It was impossible to tell. Actually, you do, Michael said firmly, standing his ground in a way that made clear he was done being patient. You accepted our invitation to appear on this program. You agreed to be here. And the least you can do is show some basic courtesy to the people who welcomed you into their homes this morning. Meghan stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward with the force of her movement. This is ridiculous. I came here to have a serious conversation about important issues, and instead I'm being lectured by someone who wouldn't understand real journalism if it hit him in the face. The personal attack only strengthened Michael's resolve, steeling him for what would become his most powerful moment of the entire confrontation. Real journalism, Meghan, involves listening to people, treating them with respect, and trying to understand different perspectives. It doesn't involve talking down to your host, insulting your audience, and acting like everyone around you is beneath your consideration. You don't know what you're talking about, Meghan shot back, her voice rising to a level that was making the audio engineers frantically adjust their equipment. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Michael replied, standing up to face her directly with quiet authority that commanded attention. I know what it's like to work with guests who are passionate about their causes but still treat everyone around them with dignity. I know what it's like to have difficult conversations about important topics without resorting to personal attacks. And I know what our viewers deserve, which is certainly better than what you've given them today. Meghan's composure was completely gone now, replaced by barely controlled rage. Your viewers don't deserve anything. They're sitting at home living their small, insignificant lives, pretending that watching morning television somehow makes them informed citizens. They need to be challenged. They need to be made uncomfortable. They need to face reality. Stop, Michael said, his voice cutting through her rant like a knife through butter. Just stop. You don't get to come on our show and attack the teachers who are shaping young minds, the healthcare workers who are saving lives, the parents who are doing their best to raise good kids, and the countless other people who make this country work every single day. The passion in his voice was unmistakable, and everyone watching understood that this wasn't just about defending his show anymore. This was about defending the millions of Americans who had been insulted by his guest's elitist attitude, about standing up for people who couldn't defend themselves against someone who thought her title made her superior. I never said Meghan started, but Michael cut her off. Yes, you did, he interrupted, the first time he'd done so throughout the entire interview. You've spent the last 30 minutes telling me and everyone watching that we're not smart enough, not sophisticated enough, not worthy enough to engage with your important ideas. Well, here's a newsflash for you. Treating people poorly doesn't make you superior. It just makes you someone people don't want to be around. The control room was getting frantic signals from network executives, but the producer had made a decision. Sometimes you had to let these moments play out, had to trust that your host knew what he was doing. And Michael Strahan absolutely knew what he was doing. Meghan was clearly rattled now, her carefully constructed public persona cracking under the pressure of someone finally standing up to her. "You have no right to speak to me this way. I am a member of the royal family. And I'm a person doing my job," Michael replied with devastating calm. "Your title doesn't give you the right to be cruel to people. It doesn't excuse your behavior, and it certainly doesn't impress me or our viewers." "This is unacceptable," Meghan said, looking around the studio, as if expecting someone to come to her rescue, to defend her against this unprecedented pushback. "I demand to speak to your producer. I demand an apology." Michael's response was swift and final, delivered with the authority of someone who'd had absolutely enough. "The only person who owes anyone an apology here is you. You owe an apology to our viewers. You owe an apology to our crew. And frankly, you owe an apology to everyone who works hard to make positive changes in the world without feeling the need to tear others down in the process." Meghan's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to anger to something approaching panic. She had clearly never been confronted so directly by someone who refused to be intimidated by her status or title. Someone who valued the dignity of ordinary people over the comfort of the privileged. "I'm leaving," she announced, pulling off her microphone and dropping it on the chair with theatrical finality. "That's probably for the best," Michael said calmly, his voice carrying no anger now, just resolution. "Security will escort you out." As if on cue, 2 security guards appeared at the edge of the set. They weren't aggressive or dramatic, just professional men doing their job, but their presence made absolutely clear that Meghan's time on Good Morning America was officially over. "This isn't over," she said, pointing at Michael as she was led away, making empty threats that everyone knew would go nowhere. "Yes, it is," he replied quietly, watching as she was escorted off the set and presumably out of the building, out of his show, and out of the chance to use his platform for her agenda. Michael turned back to face the cameras, straightened his tie with deliberate calm, and took a deep breath. When he spoke again, his voice carried all the warmth and professionalism that had made him beloved by millions of viewers, as if the last 30 minutes of hostile confrontation had never happened, as if he could simply reset to baseline kindness. "Well, folks, that certainly wasn't what we had planned for this morning," he said with a slight smile that didn't quite hide the strain of the last half hour but showed his resilience. "We'll be right back after this commercial break with a cooking segment that I promise will be much more pleasant for everyone involved." As the cameras cut away and the studio lights dimmed for the commercial break, the crew erupted in spontaneous applause, not polite professional acknowledgement, but genuine appreciation for someone who defended not just himself and his show, but every hard-working American who had been insulted by his guests' arrogant behavior. Michael had won not through cruelty or matching her hostility, but by standing firm on principles of respect and dignity, while refusing to tolerate attacks on innocent viewers. He demonstrated that kindness has limits, that professionalism doesn't mean accepting abuse, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up for people who can't defend themselves. The aftermath would dominate social media for weeks, with overwhelming support for Michael's handling of the situation and universal condemnation of his guests' behavior. It would become a masterclass in how to maintain dignity under pressure while still standing up for what's right. And it would remind America that titles don't grant license to treat people poorly, and that real respect is earned through action, not demanded through position.